This is the second episode of an 8-part series looking at the connections between RMS Titanic and the city of Dundee in Scotland. The two most discussed and debated issues around the Titanic disaster are the Californian incident, discussed in part 1 of this series, and the fact that there were not sufficient lifeboat places for everyone on board Titanic that night. On its maiden voyage, there were approximately 2,228 persons on board Titanic. An absolute figure is difficult to arrive at for a variety of reasons. The lifeboat capacity was for 1,167 persons. Why was there such a discrepancy? To look at this in some detail, we need to go back to the 19th century. In 1884, England alone recorded almost 400 shipwrecks. In those days, the first indication of a ship foundering was the non-appearance of that ship at its next port of call. No wireless communication meant that survival was not likely. In 1876, Sir Charles Adderley MP, who, as President of the Board of Trade, was the most senior government official responsible for safety at sea, stated, and I quote, "Suppose a ship wrecked in the middle of the Atlantic, with all the proposed lifeboats on board, and that all the passengers were lowered safely into them. What would become of them? They would simply be starved and die by inches instead of being drowned in this ship." End of quote. To us in the 21st century, this attitude seems bizarre, but there are many shipwrecks which support the view that Sir Charles stated. Some of these involve cannibalism, and the most infamous of these was the case of the yacht Mignonette. This vessel was on a voyage from Southampton to Sydney in Australia. It sank on this voyage 4 days out from Madeira. The surviving crew of the Mignonette, Thomas Dudley and Edward Stephen, drank the blood and ate some of the flesh of the cabin boy Richard Parker, after having nothing to eat for a week. They were picked up from the lifeboat by a German vessel, the Montezuma, and returned to England. A court case followed at Exeter Assizes, which found that the cabin boy had been killed in the lifeboat by the accused, but the case was referred to a higher tribunal. The Lord Chief Justice of England, John Coleridge, confirmed their crime was murder and sentenced them to death. However, their sentences were afterwards respited during Her Majesty's pleasure, and they were committed to Holloway Prison for 6 months. Full newspaper reports on the case are reproduced in the book Dundee Man Lost at Sea. This was by no means an isolated incident, and the truth is that the survivors, if any, of most sunken ships in those days were never found, and what happened to them is anyone's guess. The man to change all this was Guglielmo Marconi, who developed the wireless telegraph. In 1912, this was in the process of becoming a standard fitting on all ships. This was a game changer for ships in distress. With the Marconi apparatus on board, a ship could inform other ships, and possibly shore, of their problem and their location. This dramatically increased the chances of survivors and lifeboats being located and rescued. Surely this would change the attitude of those in charge of marine safety. The people with this remit were the Marine Safety Act's Life Saving Appliances Committee. It had its first meeting on the 19th of November 1888 with Thomas Henry Ismay in the chair. Mr. Ismay had founded the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, also known as the White Star Line, who were to build Titanic 20 years later. This committee was top-heavy with ship owners and shipbuilders, with frontline able seamen poorly represented. The ordinary sailor wanted to see lifeboats for all, and why not? The businessmen on the committee knew that lifeboats were expensive and took up deck space and thus the space for money-generating cabins. For them, lifeboats were a waste of money. Sir Francis Dunlop, a fellow ship owner of Ismay, thought that lifeboats cluttered up the decks. Such was the attitude of the ship owners, but they were concerned that the pressure of a lifeboats for all policy might gain some momentum. For this reason, the Secretary of the General Shipowners' Society of London, Mr. W.H. Coke, reported in a letter to the President of the Board of Trade that, and I quote, "ship owners of their own accord are making their vessels practically unsinkable by subdividing them into watertight compartments." When the committee finally reported, the ordinary sailors lost the day. Thus, in 1897, the British Board of Trade, under the provisions of the Merchant Shipping Act 1894, concocted a formula for determining the lifeboat requirements for British registered passenger ships. This formula used the tonnage of the ship as a guide to the number of lifeboats required, or more accurately, the volume of lifeboat space required, and not the number of passengers a vessel was carrying. For Titanic, the regulations required room on lifeboats for 1,060 persons. In fact, Titanic exceeded this by having room for 1,167 people. Following the Titanic disaster, there was a debate in the House of Commons. The Dundee Courier reports of this debate are reproduced in the book Dundee Man Lost at Sea. The most significant thing to come out of this debate for our present purposes was a question by Thomas Locke, MP for Islington West. His question was, and I quote, "In view of the rapid growth in the size of vessels in recent years, does not my right honourable friend think that it was a long time to leave, from 1894 to 1911, without making any regulations for vessels over 10,000 tons?" End quote. A good question indeed. And who could have done something to increase the lifeboat provision when, for example, the keel of the Leviathan Olympic at over 45,000 tons was being laid in 1908, or indeed Titanic's own keel in 1909. Large vessels such as these left the 10,000-ton rules dangerously outdated. The person who could have done something and intervened was the President of the Board of Trade at that time, Winston Spencer Leonard Churchill, then Liberal MP for Dundee. He was appointed President of the Board of Trade on the 12th of April 1908 by Liberal Prime Minister H. Asquith. This was a promotion for Churchill from his first post as a Liberal MP, which was an appointment as a junior minister at the Colonial Office. At that time, under an archaic law from 1705, a newly appointed cabinet minister was obliged to seek re-election at a by-election. At the time, Churchill was MP for Manchester North West, being elected to the seat in the 1906 general election. However, in the required by-election, he lost the seat. As soon as the result was widely known, Churchill received telegrams offering him 8 safe Liberal seats. He chose Dundee, because one of the sitting MPs, Edmund Robertson, had just been elevated to a peerage to become Baron Lockheed. Dundee was a constituency in the House of Commons from 1832 until 1950, when it was split into Dundee East and Dundee West. The by-election was held on Saturday the 9th of May 1908, and Churchill won with 44% of the vote. Interestingly, the man who would defeat Churchill for the seat in the 1922 general election, Edwin Scrimgeour, running on a prohibitionist ticket, polled only 4% of the vote. When elected in 1922, he was the only MP elected, before or since, to the House of Commons on a prohibitionist ticket. Now that he was again an MP, Churchill took over at the Board of Trade, which was ultimately responsible for marine safety. A few months before he took the helm at the Board of Trade, the yacht Argonaut sank 20 minutes after colliding with the cargo steamer Kingswell. All passengers and crew on board got off safely in lifeboats. However, there were only 130 passengers on board, even though the yacht had been licensed to carry 338 passengers. If the full passenger capacity had been taken up, there would certainly have been many fatalities. On the 19th of October 1908, T.A. Herbert, Liberal MP, asked a question in Parliament of Winston Churchill in his role as President of the Board of Trade, quote, whether there is any regulation requiring passenger vessels to be provided with lifeboat accommodation for as many passengers as they are capable of carrying. End quote. He went on to ask if the Board of Trade President was aware of the lifeboat situation in the Argonaut, and finished by asking who was responsible for this state of affairs. Churchill replied that there was no regulation requiring lifeboat accommodation for all on board, and he said, quote, I am advised that it would not be practicable in the case of very large vessels to carry the number of boats that such a regulation would require. End quote. It's worth noting that Churchill did not reply to Mr. Herbert's final question, who is responsible? The answer, of course, was the Board of Trade and its president. However, lessons were not being learned. Another chance was missed when the RMS Republic sank after colliding with the liner SS Florida in thick fog off the Nantucket coast in January 1909. She sank with a loss of 3 lives. At the time, the Republic was the largest ship to founder. It had 12 watertight bulkheads and a double bottom, just like Titanic. Many American newspapers had dubbed the Republic as unsinkable. A British inquiry was never held, and the one person who could and should have arranged such an inquiry was Winston Churchill. If an inquiry had been held, it would have dealt with the ship's speed under adverse conditions, bulkhead construction, wireless telegraphy, and adequacy of lifeboats and life-saving equipment. All these were key topics in the Titanic inquiry. If Churchill had insisted on an inquiry into the sinking of the Republic, would Titanic's story have been different? In 1909, safety regulations were up for review. Churchill had approved the names of more than a dozen members of the latest Merchant Shipping Advisory Committee, which was, as usual, heavily weighted in favour of ship owners and shipbuilders. The committee, which eventually reported in 1911, recommended very little significant change in the regulations. It took the horrendous loss of life with Titanic sinking before changes were forced on the committee. To finish this second episode of the video series, I would like to address the possible difference a lifeboats for all policy would have made to the outcome of the sinking of Titanic. The unstated assumption is that a lifeboats for all policy would have saved most, if not all, of the lives of the people aboard Titanic. But would this have been the case? The Titanic sunk in 2 hours and 20 minutes. It took Captain Smith 50 minutes to order the lowering of lifeboats. Whether he would have ordered the lowering of the boats sooner, if he knew there's room for everybody on board them, is debatable. No lifeboat drill had been undertaken on the voyage. In fact, one arranged for that Sunday morning, the 14th of April, was cancelled for some reason. Would it have made a difference? As it turned out, there was not enough time to lower all the lifeboats. The collapsible lifeboats A and B floated off the Titanic as she sank, with collapsible B being upside down as seen in the picture. The listing of the ship as she sank hampered the efficient lowering of lifeboats. So it could be argued that a lifeboats for all policy would not have made a large difference to the outcome. More details about the subjects dealt with in part 2 of this video series can be found in chapter 17 of the book Who Sank the Titanic by Robert J. Strange, and in the book Dundee Man Lost at Sea, which can be obtained at the email address shown. Part 3 will appear soon. Thank you.